Uhuru, this is White Solidarity with Black Power. Political education and campaign updates from the Uhuru Solidarity Movement, the organization of white people under the leadership of and accountable to the African People's Socialist Party. We organize in the white community for reparations to African people.
Uhuru. My name is KC, and this is...
I'm Halley.
And we are members of the Uhuru Solidarity Movement, an organization of white people that was created by and accountable to the African People's Socialist Party. And we work in the white community to raise reparations to African people, and we stand in solidarity with oppressed people everywhere. So we start every show off reading our pledge of solidarity with African people. I recognize that this unjust system built on slavery and genocide must be overturned. I pledge my solidarity with the struggle of Africans, indigenous, and other colonized peoples for self-determination, reparations, and independence in our lifetime. I recognize that Africans inside the United States, Europe, and throughout the world suffer from a lack of self-determination and control of their own resources. I recognize that this system is built on war and violence against oppressed peoples, including the ongoing war against the African community that has destroyed the lives of countless black men, women, and children, such as Mike Brown, Freddie Gray, Sandra Bland, Dominique Battle, and so many others. I pledge my solidarity with the struggle of Africans and other colonized peoples to reclaim their land, labor, resources, and self-determination. Uhuru. Now I'll pass this off to Halley, who will read our principles of unity.
We have 3 principles of unity. 1, we are under the leadership of the African People's Socialist Party. 2, we stand in solidarity with African self-determination. And 3, we organize in the white community for reparations to African people.
Thank you. So for today's show, we're going to read an article written by a comrade in the African People's Socialist Party, someone who actually recruited me into this movement. It's a really incredible article called African Trans Women, the Struggle for National Liberation and Self-Determination. And we thought that it would be good to read it in this month since it's Pride Month, and the Pride March was this past weekend. And there's a lot of talk in the media about, gender and sexuality and queerness and just the attacks in the society on people who love and express themselves outside of, normative standards of heteronormativity. And there's a lot of talk about, acceptance into this society for loving who you want to love and being who you want to be. But one thing that the Uhuru movement gets down to is that the primary source of all oppression in the world, the primary source of violence is colonialism. That rape culture, that homophobia, that patriarchy are all systems that came into huge economic power through Europe's assault on Africa, and that African people, whether they are straight or same-gender loving, cisgender or transgender, are part of the same nation, all of whom are at the bottom of the pedestal and who don't have access to their resources, who don't have access to their land, are still the most deeply impoverished, most highly incarcerated population on the planet, and that it will take more than just being accepted into this system for African people to be free, that African people need their land back and their resources back. And so this article will go into that a little bit more. So Halley's going to start us off reading this article written by Comrade Muteba of the African People's Socialist Party.
Uhuru, this is from the June issue of the Burning Spear newspaper. It's the voice of the African working class. And the article is called African Trans Women, the Struggle for National Liberation and Self-Determination. There has been much discussion in both bourgeois and independent media centered around the bodies and identities of transgender people. This has especially been the case over the course of the current political period, generally characterized by deepening imperialist instability, as well as conscious and unconscious struggle against the status quo. We see the visibility of transgender and gender nonconforming people in popular culture. We also see the LGBTQIA+ struggle for equality against discriminatory policies such as the so-called bathroom bills. These bills, under the pretense of public safety, deny transgender and gender nonconforming people the right to utilize the public restroom accommodations that best correspond to their gender identity. Somewhere amidst the bourgeois feminist milieu is mention of the persisting murder, dehumanization, and brutalization of African transgender people. It is through African internationalism that the African People's Socialist Party, the Uhuru movement, and its component mass organizations have, on different fronts, offered a dialectical and historical materialist accounting of the colonial capitalist social system that gives life to the oppression of African and colonized people throughout the world. With African internationalism, we are able to lead African people through the morass of bourgeois feminist opportunism and reactionary cultural nationalism back home to a revolutionary political philosophy and social movement that advances our ideological and organizational continuity as a people struggling against our wretched material conditions of existence.
The African People's Socialist Party welcomes all Africans with open arms. The African People's Socialist Party has provided leadership and put forward many ways in which African same-gender loving and trans individuals can raise contradictions and offer solutions around these specific issues. The 2014 International People's Democratic Uhuru Movement resolution to build and consolidate the Same Gender Loving and Trans Commission was to protect and defend the revolutionary national democratic rights of the same-gender loving trans community. Other avenues include various public educational forums calling for an end to the attacks against African same-gender loving and trans people. The African People's Education and Defense Fund sponsored Black Power 96.3 FM weekly radio program My People's Keeper, hosted by station manager Diakiesi Lungusani, also gives a voice to African same-gender loving and trans individuals. Despite diversionary criticism of our movement's inclusion of trans and same-gender loving people, we unreservedly affirm the leadership of African trans and gender nonconforming people that have assumed responsibility for the success of a unified struggle for genuine freedom and independence. This is extended to the right of African trans people to exercise armed self-defense, such as in the cases of C.C. McDonald and Kai Peterson. Both were criminalized and prosecuted by the U.S. colonial judicial system for defending themselves from trans antagonistic violence and sexual assault. In fact, the necessity of revolutionary armed struggle for political self-determination is often either obscured or replaced with a politic of educational and policy reformism within the established bourgeois LGBTQ and women's rights movements.
African transgender people can join the armed struggle against imperialism. The African People's Socialist Party is clear, however, as expressed in Chairman Amalia Shatela's political report to the 2017 plenary of the African People's Socialist Party, in its understanding that, quote, revolutionary armed struggle against colonialism and capitalism is the only thing that has ever brought any real semblance of liberation to oppressed peoples anywhere on earth, and there will be no exception for Africans. There is no correct religion, culture, or secret documents hidden from our access that, once discovered, can free us. Africans will have to assume full responsibility for our liberation by recognizing that revolution is the only solution, and that we are going to have to pursue revolution through the purifying, cleansing, exuberant process of organized, politically informed, unrelenting revolutionary violence. End quote. To restate the party's position on the equality of different sectors of the African nation, quote, it is only through a successful struggle to defeat capitalist colonial parasitism that we can guarantee absolute, unequivocal political, social, and economic equality for African people. Furthermore, we believe that a fundamental test of the progressive or revolutionary character of any organization, party, movement, or society is its commitment, confirmed in practice, to the destruction of the special oppression of women. We are determined to elevate women to their rightful place as equal partners and leaders in the forward motion of the development of human society and as leaders, makers, and shapers of human history. End quote. This includes African poor and working class trans women and other women whose womanhood may not conform to the very white Eurocentric conception of womanhood. Their definition is generally accepted as the only or most legitimate expression of womanhood throughout the history of bourgeois society and has been imposed on African and other colonized and oppressed people throughout the world today.
Gender roles are a colonial invention. As African captives under colonial subjugation, much of the way we understand ourselves, our various identities and relationships to one another as a nation of people has been defined and determined for us by institutions and social forces external and foreign to our communities. These external forces serve to reinforce and justify our exploitation and material conditions of existence under a social system born and maintained by our enslavement, colonization, and imposed economic and political prostration. Much of how we understand so-called masculinity and femininity has little or nothing to do with gender. These terms have much more to do with capitalism and the legal and social conventions placed around our ability to produce the means of sustaining life for ourselves socially and collectively. For instance, weaving textiles, making clothing, nursing, childcare, and other roles generally considered women's work in bourgeois society, while men's work includes the construction of infrastructure, laying roads, and building houses. Even benign characteristics such as favoring the colors pink versus blue are subject to bourgeois colonial interpretations. In bourgeois society, gender and its commonly associated traits, roles, and responsibilities have much less to do with what individuals desire, their physiological ability, or their material interests, and much more to do with the need of the white ruling class to maintain control over the means of production in society.
Gender has been violently developed as a colonial norm. Additionally, gender isn't simply defined by what many of us think we understand about biology, or the ability to bear children, or whatever biological function we have been taught ultimately determines one's gender identity. Many who share the same gender identity may experience some sense of sameness based on some shared biological function. However, none of these functions contribute to most folks experiencing a sense of sameness with a dog, a pig, or any other non-human animal, or contribute to Africans sharing the same social status as white people that may share the same biological function. In reality, gender identity and gendered expressions are socially determined in part by a very subjective and intimate understanding of oneself in relation to other people and the various institutions in human society. And in this society we live in today, the state, all of its institutions, its social and legal conventions known as its superstructure, much of what passes for culture has achieved prominence and definition by violently expropriating African, indigenous, and other colonized people's land, labor, resources, and right to self-determination. Much of modern science regarding so-called female reproductive health is accredited to butchers like James Marion Sims, taught in medical institutions today as the so-called father of modern gynecology. This white man tortured and experimented on enslaved African women against their will, and in most cases without anesthesia. That says a lot about so-called modern science and our understanding of the human body and health.
The African People's Socialist Party's stance is clear. Much of the way we understand ourselves is a direct product of the continuation of slavery and colonialism. We have to be very clear on that in order to struggle for the level of principle, unity, and organization that will wipe away all the arbitrary geopolitical and social borders that keep us locked into this existing state of seemingly permanent misery, poverty, and ignorance. There is much more that can and must be said regarding this particular issue. The African People's Socialist Party's position on the question is simply this. We believe African trans people are part and parcel of a colonized and oppressed African nation who, like almost our entire population, are systematically denied the right to political independence, genuine self-determination, and the organizational capacity to feed, clothe, house, protect, defend, and otherwise govern ourselves as a free people. Therefore, African trans people, particularly African trans women, are subject to the abject brutality, dehumanization, and poverty afforded most people living under the boot of colonialism. A contradiction that confronts our just struggle today, as many African people have been bamboozled and don't see African trans folks as such. African trans people are often viewed as deceptive interlopers in our own communities and treated as disposable pariahs. Thus, African trans folks, particularly of the poor and working class, remain one of the most isolated and slandered sectors of our population, leaving African transgender people particularly vulnerable to horizontal and vertical state-sanctioned violence. African trans women in the United States have life expectancies in the 30s and are disproportionately pushed into other forms of subsistence work, sometimes within the informal, illegal sex trade economy. The struggle for African trans folks, like other oppressed and colonized people, is a struggle for independent Black political power in our own Black hands over our own Black lives. We struggle for the right to exist independently of the false assumptions and antagonistic ideas held by many about African trans people. Our work and responsibility as African internationalists, therefore, is to deepen and win this general position amongst the masses and struggle to bring as many of our people into active participation in the revolutionary transformation of the African nation. We must also ensure the utter destruction of the existing capitalist colonial social system. We must ensure the founding of a new world shorn forever of the oppressor and the oppressed. Become an African internationalist. Uhuru.
Uhuru. Wow.
I was just really excited to read this article written by Muteba, the same gender-loving and gender non-conforming trans feminine African person who recruited me into this movement and made it clear that it was my responsibility, our responsibility as white people, to be in solidarity with the struggle of the national liberation of African people, all African people, same gender loving, trans, and otherwise. And that, you know, we know there is a lot of critiques of the Pride March going on, that this is a march, this whole movement was started by the brilliant and courageous resistance of an African trans women at Stonewall, the Stonewall Rebellion, where African trans women who had been brutalized by the police and were having their party and their space for themselves interrupted by state violence, they fought back with necessary and important self-defense. They fought back, and now you have a gay rights movement that's mostly led by white gay men who still live on the backs of all African people. And so, you know, the 60s, we saw the struggle of Africans during the Black Power movement. We saw it as very democratic, anti-imperialist, and open to all people. And it opened the doors to the gay rights movement, to the women's rights movement, to the disability rights movement. And Huey P. Newton of the Black Panther Party made it very clear that the struggle for gay liberation and for people to be accepted for who they were was part of the struggle for a new world where Black people had power over their own lives and where Black children could live without fear of being shot down by the police. And I think that this article is really amazing because it explains that the same violence that from police that kills Black children in their beds and on the streets, that kills Black men, that kills Black women like Sandra Bland, has the same source of violence in the frequent murder of poor working class African trans women like Kiki Collier and Mesha Caldwell, two of dozens of African trans women that have been brutally murdered this year alone, and that these struggles are connected and have the same source of violence in the state. And so in the Uhuru movement, we make it very clear that we are out to end all forms of oppression, and to do that we have to fight for African liberation. And as white people, it is so necessary to join organization, Uhuru Solidarity Movement, the only organization of white people that pays reparations to the African nation, to take responsibility that this violence is on, you know, that we are complicit and that we need to join an anti-colonial struggle, and that as white queers, that our interests lie in complete solidarity with the struggle of African people for national liberation. So, which is a great segue into an event that we have coming up that Halley is going to talk about.
Yeah, the Uhuru Solidarity Movement, we host monthly web conferences where you can participate anywhere. You call in and watch a slideshow together, or not a slideshow, you see a presentation. And this month, our web conference is called White LGBT Solidarity with Black Power, No Pride in Genocide. It's happening Thursday, June 29th from 8 to 9:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And it's exactly what Casey was talking about. As a white queer person, we don't want our rights, our queer rights, at the expense of the Black community. We have to be in solidarity with them, because even things like the gay rights movement, the gay liberation movement, got its name from the Black liberation movement. And so I'm just going to read the text of this web conference here. It's going to be very powerful. Join the Uhuru Solidarity Movement's June web conference, White LGBT Solidarity with Black Power, No Pride in Genocide. Our keynote speaker will be Gazi Kodzo, Director of the National Office of Recruitment and Membership in the African People's Socialist Party. Gazi is a same-gender-loving individual who struggles daily to push forward the liberation of African people. The African People's Socialist Party has provided leadership and put forward many ways in which African same-gender-loving and trans individuals must be leaders in the struggle for Black power. This webinar will also feature Jackson Hollingsworth, chair of the White LGBT Solidarity with Black Power Working Group of the Uhuru Solidarity Movement. He is a very strong leader in the movement to build reparations to African people and sets the way forward for other white people of the LGBT community to take a principled stance in solidarity with African and other colonized people. The Uhuru Solidarity Movement's LGBT Working Group has the goal of winning thousands of white LGBT people to take them beyond the opportunistic politics of the Pride March and lead them towards the principled stance of white solidarity with African liberation. Join this web conference, bring your questions, and learn about unity through reparations. Uhuru Solidarity Movement is the organization of white people that was created by and works under the leadership of the African People's Socialist Party, which leads the Uhuru movement for African liberation and is guided by the theory of African internationalism, seeing the world through the eyes of the African working class. We organize in the white community to raise reparations to African people, reversing the stream of stolen resources hoarded in our communities. We host monthly web conferences to deepen our political understanding of current events and raise white reparations to Black Star Industries, the Black Power economic institutions of the party. Uhuru.
Thank you, Halley. Uhuru. Yes, if any of this spoke to you, if you're critical of the pride marches that have police marching in them, where the police are responsible for the murder of African children, for the murder of same-gender-loving African people, for pushing same-gender-loving African people and trans African people and all African people into prisons by the boatload, if you're critical of the Pride March that is sponsored by oil companies and by banks and beer companies that only serve as parasites in oppressed communities, if you're critical of any of this, please come to this web conference. It's going to be really eye-opening, and it will show that, again, like Halley said, I totally unite, that I, as a white queer woman, don't want my rights at the expense of the Black community, that we want to stand up and say that our true interests as white queers lie in complete solidarity with the struggle for Africa to be free, to stop being looted, and for African people to have self-determination, where African trans women will have power over their own lives so they can't be murdered and discarded, and where they can be a part of their communities.
Uhuru. So to register for that, again, it's Thursday, June 29th, starting at 8 p.m. to 9:30 p.m. You can register at tinyurl.com/NoPrideInGenocide.
Right on, yes, tinyurl.com/NoPrideInGenocide. June 29th, 8 to 9:30 Eastern Time. And we have one more announcement. The Uhuru Solidarity Movement in Boston, if you live in this area, if you live in Somerville, Cambridge, Jamaica Plain, Roxbury, Dorchester, come to our next event. It is a fundraiser for a huge campaign that the whole movement does in October called Days in Solidarity with African People. This year, we're bringing Chairman Omali Yeshitela, which is huge. They murdered Malcolm X. They murdered Fred Hampton. They exiled Assata Shakur. All these Black Power freedom fighters, they murdered them, they locked them up, or they exiled them. But they didn't do that with Chairman Omali Yeshitela, and he has been organizing the Uhuru Movement for African Liberation since 1972, and he's coming to Boston, and that's huge. And he'll be rallying white people and allies of African liberation to show why this this is the future, why we need to fight for the victory of black power over white power, and we need to raise resources to get him here. So we're having our first fundraiser, and it'll be at Parts and Crafts, which is a maker space in Somerville, on Somerville at 577 Somerville Ave, and that is Wednesday, June 21st, from 7 to 9 p.m. And we're going to be showing part 2 of a documentary that we showed last time. It's called Cuba, an African Odyssey, and it's about Cuba's support for African revolution, how when African people were fighting back against colonization in Angola and in the Congo and in South Africa, what's referred to as South Africa, Cuba supported African people and stood on the side of African people and sent soldiers and doctors and food and material solidarity with African liberation. And that's what Uhuru Solidarity movement is all about. So we salute the Cuban Revolution. We want to teach people the real story, not what we learn in colonial education. So come out, it's $10, and that pays for your dinner and to watch this great movie and have a discussion with a group of people that want to see African people free and want to see humanity free. It's going to be really great. So again, that's Wednesday, June 21st, 7 to 9 p.m. at Parts and Crafts in Somerville. $10 door fee, gets you dinner, and supports a really incredible campaign about African people being free.
Uhuru, thank you so much for tuning in. This was the second episode of our show, White Solidarity with Black Power. My name is Halley Murray. This is KC Mackey here. For more information on our Boston chapter, you can go to facebook.com/USM Boston. You can email us at usmboston@riseup.net. And we have weekly meetings, so if you email us, we can send you our agenda and you can join us in the organizing for white reparations to African people. Thanks for tuning in. See you next time.
Uhuru means freedom.